Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're going to be looking at something pretty interesting. We're going to be looking at how Gen Z feels about cars. Are they really ditching this whole car ownership thing? Or, is there a little bit more to the story? We got some excerpts here from a couple of articles. Calpurnia's Note and Nota di Luca Angelini. Both of these are in Italian, but they really get into, all the details, all the different perspectives.
Yeah, it is fascinating to see how, the economics and the social values, even technology, it's all kind of coming together to shape how this generation thinks about transportation. Makes you wonder.
Yeah.
Makes you think about all those assumptions we have about, cars and freedom.
It really does. And one of the things that really struck me was just how much the numbers have changed. One of the articles pointed out that, back in 1997, 43% of U.S. teens had their driver's licenses. But by 2020, that number had plummeted to just 25%. And we're seeing similar trends in other countries, too. They mentioned the UK. And in Italy, there are actually 43% fewer cars owned by young Italians now than there were just a decade ago.
Really?
So it really makes you wonder, is getting your driver's license still that big rite of passage that it used to be?
Right. Like, is it still a big deal? Maybe the idea of freedom is changing for Gen Z. Maybe the car isn't, that ultimate symbol of independence that it once was.
And speaking of symbolism, both of these articles brought up Olivia Rodrigo's song Driver's License. And, on the surface, it seems like it's kind of, reinforcing that whole yearning for the open road, that classic image. But I'm curious, could there be something more going on there? Could it actually be reflecting a sense of frustration? Like, maybe Gen Z sees the car as something unattainable or even undesirable.
That's a really interesting take on it.
Yeah.
Pop culture often reflects what a generation is feeling. And those lyrics, they definitely hint at this longing for something that's just out of reach. It would make sense if that resonated with, young people who are facing the realities of car ownership today.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So we've got these dropping license rates. We've got this potential shift in how Gen Z views cars. But why is this happening? One of the articles really dug into the economic side of things, especially in Italy. They talked about stagnant wages, rising car prices. It's a tough situation for anybody trying to afford a car these days. And they even mentioned that, it's Chinese cars are becoming more and more popular over there as a more budget-friendly option.
I mean, the economic angle is huge.
Yeah.
For a lot of young people, owning a car just isn't financially feasible. So they have to kind of, reevaluate their priorities and look for other ways to get around.
Exactly. Which brings us to the rise of all these alternatives. We've got ride-sharing apps, bike-sharing programs. Public transportation is getting better in a lot of places. All these options make it easier to ditch the car, especially if you're living in a city.
Oh, absolutely. And, it's not just convenience. I think these alternatives are actually changing how cities function. For a generation that's tech-savvy, that's used to on-demand services, these options just fit right into their lifestyle.
It's not just about practicality, though, right? Could there be kind of a shift in values going on here, too?
I think so. There's definitely this growing awareness of the environmental impact of cars. One of the articles even talked about how cars are being, almost demonized as symbols of pollution. And that really aligns with Gen Z's focus on sustainability. It's probably shaping their choices.
For sure. Then we run into some information that seems to contradict all of this. One of the articles mentioned that there was actually a pandemic-driven spike in car ownership. And guess who was leading the charge? Gen Z. So on one hand, we have this long-term trend of, less interest in cars. But then on the other hand, we have this sudden increase. What's going on here?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? It shows you how complex this whole issue is. The pandemic definitely changed things. Suddenly, personal space and control became really important. And a car offers that in a way that other forms of transportation just don't.
So how do we make sense of these seemingly conflicting trends? Well, the article pointed to millennials as a potential parallel. They were initially hesitant about car ownership, too. But as they got older, started families move to the suburbs. Well, a car became more of a necessity. Do you think Gen Z might follow a similar path?
It's definitely possible. We also see these patterns with generations. But they're not always straightforward. Millennials delayed certain things, but they eventually reached those milestones as their circumstances change. So, I wouldn't be surprised to see Gen Z's relationship with the car evolve in a similar way.
It's like they're hitting the pause button on car ownership, not necessarily pressing delete.
Exactly. And what happens when they hit play again? That's what's so fascinating about this whole discussion. What's so fascinating is, if this whole Gen Z trend continues, what could that mean for for our cities, our infrastructure, even our way of life?
Okay, so paint a picture for me. What would this car light future actually look like?
Well, imagine, cities designed for people, not for cars. Where pedestrians and cyclists and public transit users,
Yeah.
they're the priority. Picture these vibrant, walkable neighborhoods where you could run most of your errands without ever needing a car. More green spaces, less traffic, a real shift away from that car-centric design that we're used to.
That sounds amazing. But wouldn't that require like a massive overhaul of, pretty much all of our infrastructure? That seems like a pretty daunting task.
Oh, it'd be a huge undertaking.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We need to invest a lot in public transit, create safe bike lanes, make our streets more pedestrian friendly. And we'd have to change zoning laws too, encourage more mixed use development, like where you've got residential and commercial and recreational spaces all kind of integrated together so people wouldn't have to commute as far.
It's like we'd have to rethink how we design cities from the ground up. But what about those who live outside of those major urban centers? Could they realistically adapt to this car-light lifestyle?
That's a really good question. While urban areas are kind of ahead of the game, when it comes to alternative transportation, suburbs and rural areas face some unique challenges. Bridging that gap would require some creative solutions, maybe on-demand ride-sharing services that are tailored to, less densely populated areas,
Mhm.
or microtransit systems that offer more flexible options.
So technology could play a key role in shaping this car-light future. But it's not just about the infrastructure and the logistics, right? What about the social impact? How might our interactions and relationships change in a world where cars are less central to our lives?
That's a great point. Cars have really shaped our social landscape. They've allowed us to spread out, which has led to sprawling suburbs and long commutes. But what if moving away from cars actually fostered a sense of community? Imagine running into your neighbors more often,
Mhm.
walking your kids to school, having these spontaneous encounters with people in your community. It'd be a real shift towards more localized living.
It sounds kind of idyllic, but wouldn't there be potential downsides too? Would we lose some of our privacy, our independence?
There are always trade-offs.
Hmm.
A car-light society would definitely have to address concerns about safety, especially for women and other vulnerable groups. Making sure that everyone has equitable access to transportation options would be crucial. You would need to design public spaces that are not only accessible, but also safe and inclusive for everyone.
So it's not just about swapping out cars for bikes or buses. It's about creating a system that works for everyone.
Exactly. It requires a shift in our mindset and moving away from this idea that owning a car is a right or a measure of your success. We need to embrace a more holistic view of transportation, one that prioritizes sustainability, accessibility, and community well-being.
This whole conversation reminds me of something one of the articles mentioned, this idea of Carmageddon. Basically, it argues that our current level of car dependence is just not sustainable, environmentally or socially. What are your thoughts on that?
Carmageddon might be a bit dramatic, but I think the underlying message is valid. Our transportation system is facing serious challenges.
For sure.
Climate change, air pollution, traffic congestion, social isolation. These are all consequences of relying so heavily on cars. It's a wake-up call. It's telling us that we need to rethink our relationship with the automobile and start exploring other options.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that we can't just keep doing what we've always done. It feels like we're at a crossroads, a point where we have this opportunity to create a better future, one where transportation is more efficient, more sustainable, more equitable. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential here. There's definitely a growing momentum for change, driven by younger generations, by technological advancements, and by a growing awareness that we need to do something. But it's going to take a concerted effort from policymakers, from urban planners, from individuals. We all need to work together to create a transportation system that truly serves the needs of both people and the planet.
It's a massive undertaking, but also a really exciting one.
It is. And, it all starts with asking ourselves some basic questions, like what role do we want transportation to play in our lives, in our communities? What choices can we make, big or small, that will contribute to a more sustainable, more accessible, and more enjoyable way of getting around.
It's empowering to think that our individual choices can actually make a difference. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. Started with some data about Gen Z and cars, and now we're imagining like entirely new ways of, living and moving through our cities.
It's really amazing how, it seems like a simple question about car ownership can lead to all these other big ideas. You talked about urban design, social equity, the role of technology, even our own values and, what we want out of life.
It's been fascinating to see how all those pieces fit together. But before we wrap up, I'd love to kind of distill some key takeaways for our listeners. Like, what are the big aha moments they should walk away with?
Okay, well, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that Gen Z's relationship with cars, it really is different from previous generations. It's not just about, being able to afford a car or not. It's a combination of economic realities, the availability of alternatives, and this growing concern for the environment.
Right. It's not just as simple as saying Gen Z hates cars. I
Right.
mean, we've got Olivia Rodrigo singing about getting her driver's license. We've got this,
Yeah.
you know, pandemic-induced spike in car buying. It's complicated. It's changing. And
Yeah.
that's what makes it so interesting.
Exactly. And the second takeaway, I think, is that this trend has the potential to change so much more than just the auto industry.
Hmm.
It has implications for how we design our cities, what technologies we invest in, even how we interact with each other on a daily basis.
It's like this ripple effect. One change leads to another and another. So
Yeah.
that brings us to our final thought-provoking question, the one we always like to leave our listeners with. If this trend keeps going, if Gen Z really embraces alternative transportation and shifts away from car dependency, how will that reshape the world as we know it?
It's a great question. It really makes you think about all the possibilities. Will we see a resurgence of these vibrant, walkable communities where daily life revolves around, human connection instead of car commutes? Will technology be able to bridge the gap for people in rural areas or the suburbs, to make sure that everyone has access to convenient and sustainable transportation options?
And will we take advantage of this opportunity to create a more sustainable and equitable future for everyone? One where transportation is no longer a barrier to opportunity, but a pathway to a healthier, more connected society.
These are all important questions to think about, not with, fear or resistance, but with a sense of curiosity and a willingness to embrace the unknown. Because within this challenge, there's also this incredible potential for positive change.
So to our listeners, we leave you with those questions to ponder. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time for another exploration into the fascinating trends shaping our world.